Philosophers talk to our times, towards an ethnography of a self-poisoning mind. Today I'm going to do real ethnography. I call this series ethnography, but I haven't really done any. And so ethnography is kind of a study from within a society, looking at the way elements of it evolve, change, form patterns, stable wholes, that sort of stuff. It's an account then. And what I want to give account of, really, is almost a testament. Because it's worth remembering. The world I was brought up with, as I always say, I'm 57. The occult was very marginal. Back in the day, in the 70s, in my school, most kids would be professed to be lazy Christians. I think in my end class of about 30 students, there was one kid who said, "I'm an atheist, I can't be doing with God." This is about the age of 9. Well, I was down on the other end of the extreme. I always say the best vaccination against religion is a good Anglican upbringing. We went to church every single Sunday, unless we had a good reason to not go to church every single Sunday. And it gave me a healthy knowledge of the Bible, which is its own anecdote. Be that as it may. When I was at university, I became very interested I was doing anthropology, and I became very interested in the issue of the occult. Both ways round. Both studying it anthropologically and just interesting. And interested in things, for instance, yes, the similarities between the basic Crowley theology and structuralism. It seemed to me that they were mirrors of each other. I was only 19. Anyway, so that meant I always wanted to do a project, a study on the occult. Now, it didn't happen partly because I was lazy, partly because I got a bit absorbed by my own ethnography, a bit too close to it, so that made it a little bit too difficult. But back then, it was the occult. Studying the occult was firmly a minority sport. I remember a student at the time. One of my fellow students said, "Oh, I don't think it's that important." Now, to be fair to the Cambridge anthropologists, they had begun to realise that the return of the beliefs in witchcraft, the recreation of what was professed to be an old way, but was actually a very modern, very dynamic faith, both occult but also Wiccan, was going to be one of the dynamic forces for religion. And so they were very interested in me in the study. Surprisingly interested, more interested, it has to be said. I had just discovered Foucault by then. More interested than I was. I was interested in it as a way of trying to find a place in academia, and it was something I knew about. They were interested in it because they were interested in it. Back in the day, so this would have been right at the beginning of the 90s, maybe 89 even. The old occult movement was divided up into, two main camps? There was a well-heeled camp. There were the Wiccans, and they were often very respectable middle-class folk who had fallen off from normal mainstream religion and were finding a different way to analyse, to re-enchant their worlds. And then there was the occult movement, that was my speciality. To its shame, or to my shame at the time actually, fulfilled the maxim of I.M. Lewis, that witchcraft was the religion of the dispossessed. So they were groups of people who, for whatever reason, often drugs, but also this was the end of the 80s. So those people who had been unemployed their entire working lives, which was of course then a new phenomenon, or had been squeezed by alcoholism or family breakup into certain social groups. There were a lot of abuse victims. And one of the things the occult did was to make sense of very, very shattered lives. It allowed them to understand it against a bigger framework. It allowed them to see it as a way to have power, a way to understand their world. More than that, it provided images that you could project a shattered life into. Dark gods and good. Sigils to hold us all down. It was very powerful. It was very useful. It was, in fact, very therapeutic. But it was very marginal. And then the New Age happened, of course. What was happening against the backdrop of this? And you get, over the 90s, the gradual normalisation, both of Wicca and of the occult. The Wicca movement is interesting because it gets caught up within the New Age health movement, and then ultimately promoted by the Daily Mail. And the link between organisations that I would probably describe as fairly far to the right, like Daily Mail journalism. I was once really attacked by the Daily Mail back in the XR days for protesting. And they're nasty. They're genuinely not. They only didn't really go for me because my partner at the time, she'd just developed MS, and they really didn't want to go for me because they knew that I was nursing. And that, to be fair to them, that hit another one of their buttons, so they weren't as nasty as they were trying to be. Anyway, but one of the interesting things was they adopt that kind of Wiccan approach, and they normalise it. Now, this is one of those ones that is actually I also find interesting. Because the aristocrats, the old aristocrats, I probably mean the royal family, but also those in that kind of circle, also had never quite abandoned alternative therapies. And we're always caught up in kind of Chinese medicines, but it gets very normalised in the 90s. Why? Well, that's an interesting topic. My old professor in Cambridge, I'm not sure I ever bought it really. Gellner said the problem was with the Enlightenment is it made for very, very boring religion. And if you've got boring religion and you have minds that race, and minds that want to understand the world and comprehend their place within it, and they can't get at the philosophy, then the occult movement was peculiarly suited, the Wiccan movement, was peculiarly suited for finding you a place in the world, finding you your own value. It would create therapies that were based around you and you alone. It suited them. It suited, yes, an ethic of individualism, but an ethic of individualism that ached for a wider world. And so the adoption of the Daily Mail was something slightly different, I think. But you can see it in terms of a wide social trend. The Daily Mail, what was they doing with it? They were doing it because it sold newspapers. It also allowed them to speak directly to their clientele, to their readers, to tell them something that nobody else would tell them. In a sense, it built reliance. And make no mistake, the therapeutic value of alternative religions is one of their main attractions. They are very good at filling a hole that Christianity had long since abandoned, a hole of individual religion, individual relationship. I say Christianity is abandoned. I can hear all the Evos say, that's us, that's us, that's us. Sane Christianity, the stuff that actually can read the Bible and understand it for what it is, that is a historical document locked in the ethics of the first century, with glaring problems. So those people who could read a document sensibly, I mean the Anglican faith, had long since really abandoned that direct ability to speak to individual redemption. And it was absolutely clear that the Eastern religions, the New World religion, the New Age religions were speaking to that element. And in the Daily Mail, they found an echo that normalised them, that put them through society, that made them into a middle-class vice. The Wiccans of the 90s became almost normalised. Okay, and blended across an entire society. It also created one of those things that the young me, wanting to study occultism, which was linked, of course, to revolutionary force, would have found most troubling. To be fair to myself, I did find it troubling at the time, which was that there was a huge dimension within which a certain sort of New Age and a huge amount of belief in a certain set of gods was enormously right-wing. So it always was. There was always a point at which the looking for individual enlightenment was rather a selfish creed. And it was caught within a denial of socialism, a denial of the necessity towards progressive politics, and a concentration on an individuality that was always, in the end, linked to money. And very many of the therapists of those days, I'm now in the 2000s, I remember were very, very interested in money. I shall put it like that. And so back in the day, I went through a very jagged period where I would be consistently undermining of all New Age ideology, just on a point of principle, really, because I objected to the concept of the soul, which was their ontological definitions, which seemed to me to be childish, the money that went with them, and the right-wing ethic of individuality that went between the two of them. So it created this hidden within fluffy language, within a fluffy language that tended to defend it itself. It created then the initial prototype for that episteme that haunts our world today. And during the 2010s, the internet kind of just totally normalized it, so that it became everywhere. Everybody was interested in alternative therapy. Everybody was caught up then within the individuality of personal redemption, but also everybody was caught up everybody was exposed, I'm going to put it like that, to the fact that these doctrines were always the children of Thatcherism. The occult movement was created. I'm going to say something very controversial that would lose me all my old friends. It was created in the world of Thatcher, and the occult movement represented the disadvantaged in that world, who are trying to kind of lose themselves within drugs and lose themselves within visions that allow themselves to go back to a world in which they were no longer disadvantaged. But that was always infiltrated a bit by the far right, but that was direct. While, on the other hand, the New Age world was very much the child of Thatcherism. It would be the religion you would define if you were thinking about how you would worship individuality and personal redemption, a personal union with some sort of divinity. I mean, evangelical Christianity is fairly similar, but that's why they hate the occult, I think, why they hate Wiccans so much. But Wiccanism made it very, very personal, your own personal relationship with a God, where a theology has withered and died. And so, in the ethic of the endless Tory governments of the 2010s, the endless right-wing governments in Britain, the New Age simply became very, very normalised. It became just the way people were understanding the world. And come 2020 and the so that by 2020, part of that understanding was something. You see, there was always a very underhand commercialism within the Daily Mail account of the universe. So one of the reasons they attack drug companies is because they're actually promoting far more pernicious drug companies in my own book. So those companies that sell quack nostrums, petty cures, that will that have no scientific proof, and sometimes have a made up pedigree that is actually no pedigree whatsoever. All that sort of stuff was a terribly lucrative market. And so but it did involve having to lambast, attack big pharma. Now, don't get me wrong, big pharmacological companies have misused their place. They are extremely wicked and unethical, I think is what I would say. And there is big problems with them. But the alternatives are just as unethical. And they have to do all of that, and they don't need scientific testing. None at all. They can simply sell a quack nostrum. And quack nostrums were relatively cheap and didn't involve you having to encounter the fact that the health service was under a lot of stress, and so they simply became the norm. And within such quack nostrums, there is a direct attack on medical evidence. Attacking big pharma, as you see, is one thing. Attacking medical evidence is quite a different. But there is a commercial interest within those very large companies that are manufacturing colloidal silver, but also endless remedies of dubious effect. Within that group, there is a vestige interest in attacking medical evidence, in attacking science. And so by the time COVID came along with its fears, the entire groundwork for the firestorm we're now in was set. Already vaccines were unpopular. Vaccines are pushed. Here in France, they push them all the time. And they want to vaccine everybody for everything. Now, I understand that. Vaccines is what you do when your health service doesn't really work very well, because they're very cheap. And they allow you to make your population fundamentally less likely to become gripped by disease. And yes, it does sacrifice certain members of it, absolutely. Not many, but certain. Which we don't like to think about. But then, to be honest with you, so does anaesthetics. So, makes your money, takes your price. And vaccination was the alternative strategy to a failing healthcare system. I mean, so you have on the one level those people who are peddling the new age type solutions, and then on the other you have vaccinations. No wonder they felt themselves in conflict, because both are reactions to a healthcare system that is not actually up to treating people, and therefore must find other ways of dealing with large-scale infections. And so COVID becomes a perfect storm where the two will have wage an absolute battle. And you hive off. Now, in my little world, it's almost the entire population, but that's because I live in a very, very strange bubble, who are now highly anti-vaccine, highly anti-medical knowledge, and therefore terribly vulnerable to all right-wing ideologies. All ideologies to that episteme that will deny global warming, as it will deny the power of big pharma, as it will deny the power of the state while quietly endorsing government parties, I mean things like Farage and Trump, who want to use the state to line their own pockets. It creates then a perfect storm that was trialled donkeys years ago in the 90s, but now has become the norm for a large chunk of our population. As this return, as we live in the post-Enlightenment society, for a large number of our the population, and watching that happen over the course of the life, being part of it. For parts, I was part of occultism for really quite a long time, longer than I like to remember. And I certainly have a lot of friends who are caught up in the New Age movement, many of whom are the most wonderful human beings I could care to mention. And yet, the ideology in which they're caught up in is one that is part of a right-wing episteme that will deny the possibility that we actually have to change the world in which we live in, and will catch us in the end in the trap of a heating world beyond any control.